Scripting for the Web WS300 Platt College. Events, timers, and animation frame rate. I mentioned at the start of class that events happen in the browser all the time. When we resize a window, when we scroll, when we click, all of these events are seen in the browser. The question is whether or not we have programmed a response to those specific events. If we do something and a page does not respond, it is because there is no listener programmed to respond in a specific way to that specific event happening. There are lots of kinds of events, as I just mentioned, and when we need our page to respond to the user, we have to think about what type of event would be appropriate and what element might need to be attached to. For example, a keyboard event might need to be attached to a specific input box, or it could be attached to the document. It depends on what you want to accomplish. This will get more intuitive as you continue to program for the web. Like a lot of people, I get packages delivered to my door. This can be a wide variety of things, but let's say I ordered some yarn. I get an email alerting me that I should expect my yarn to arrive today, so I am primed to listen for activity at my door. If someone rings my doorbell, I then go to the door and see if it is my package. You can think of an event listener in the same way. In the case of my situation, there could be a number of responses depending on who or what is at my door. The doorbell is the trigger or the event listener for me to get up and go answer the door. Once I've answered the door, I might run a subroutine for how to respond based off of what is there. You can think of the process of getting up and answering the door as a function. The function called upon the ringing of the doorbell, then inside of that function I might have a conditional statement that elicits a different response based off of what is there. Is it my package? Great, I'll open the door and retrieve my package. Is it a solicitor? I might ignore them or close the door in their face. These kinds of things as humans we don't really think about, but computers have to be told to respond to specific conditions in specific ways. Events tell your program to listen or wait for when something happens. Once that thing happens, perform an action. This is some example code. What can be found on this slide is a list of JavaScript events. More can be found at the W3 schools and, of course, on the Mozilla Developer Network. On this slide is a list of jQuery event shortcuts. You can find more in the jQuery API documentation, or you can find them on the W3 schools as well. This is an example of jQuery's on method. It is shown with the optional data argument and a parameter capturing the event object. This is seen with the value start as a second argument, that is the optional data, and the parameter e inside of the function's parentheses. We'll explain more on the event object and its properties shortly. The important thing to know is that when using jQuery, its on method is considered a best practice. Because the on method allows a level of control with the use of namespace, shown here as start, namespace is not necessary for most of the things that we are doing in this class, but it is something I want you to know at least exists. For further information, go to the URL shown on the slide, and additionally, I need you to know that jQuery's on method has an off method, which allows us to remove an event listener when we need to. You will see this demonstrated in class when we do slideshows. You can see here that both JavaScript and jQuery use the same concepts for attaching an event and running code. First, we need to select an element or an object. Then we assign an event to listen for. Then we tell it what function to run once that event has been detected. This can either be a named function or an anonymous one. On this slide, you can see here that JavaScript's add event listener is very similar to jQuery's on method. JavaScript also has a remove event listener method, much like jQuery's off method. In vanilla JavaScript, add event listener is considered a best practice, as jQuery's on method is also considered a best practice. As older browsers get phased out, these methods are becoming more and more the standard. Here are shown several examples of how to attach events to objects with JavaScript. The first method is considered a poor practice these days. For much the same reason we do not want to mix our CSS with our HTML, we don't want to mix our JavaScript with it either. But JavaScript has been used on the web since the late 1990s, and for a time this was the main way of doing things. Today it is considered a poor practice, and do not use this in your code when writing JavaScript. You will see some examples of this in the W3 schools. This is sometimes done for ease in the example on the page. The second method is an okay practice and is widely used. In the example, it uses an anonymous function, but a named function could be used instead. Most functions we see have a name and therefore can get called over and over to run from multiple events. But the anonymous function only runs when the specific event is fired and when the event calls the code to run, as if we had called it by name. The third method is the best practice that we can use. And we can use the remove event listener to remove the listener as well. There may be times when we would want to do this. The only problem with add event listener and remove event listener is that they do not work in Internet Explorer 8 or lower, but we probably don't have to worry about that anymore. As mentioned earlier, the parameter in the event function allows us to capture event data. The event object gets stored in the variable in the parentheses next to the function. As a variable, it can be named anything, but it is frequently abbreviated as E, EVT, or sometimes spelled out as event to label what that parameter has captured. In order for me to reference the event object and its properties, I need to reference the same variable in which it was stored. In the example of the code of this slide, that would be E. So E becomes e.which or e.target, etc. Though the example is seen here with the use of jQuery objects and method, this works the same way in pure JavaScript. E.target tells me which element received the click. If I have a click event listener attached to a larger container that may have several items within it, I can see what child item received the click with E.target. E.pageX and E.pageY would give me the XY coordinates on the document where the click event happened. And the keyword this is the object that called the function to run. Timers are technically not events, but they do work in a similar way, so I like to include them alongside the discussion of events. A timer runs a function when the amount of time in milliseconds has passed. So instead of an event happening for the code to run, a timer calls the code to run instead. The difference between the two methods seen here are set interval and set timeout is that set interval repeats, in this case every 5 seconds, while set timeout only happens once, in this case after 3 seconds. Here is another example of timers. In this case, we are storing the timer in a variable. By storing the timer in a variable, we are able to stop them before the time has passed with clear interval or the clear timeout functions. I like to think of these variables storing the value of the timer as kind of a handle for the timer. By storing the timer in a variable, I now have control over it. By using the variable in the clear functions as seen here, JavaScript knows which timer to stop. Clear interval must be used when set interval is used, and clear timeout when set timeout is used. It would be nice to be able to turn off all the timers at once with one command, but sadly it does not work that way yet. For the best JavaScript animations, use request animation frame. This works like a set timeout in that all it does is request the next animation frame of your browser. This is connected to your browser's refresh rate, which will vary based off of a number of factors. This can be if the page is in focus, if you have a lot of other tabs open in the background and they have animations, and how much your CPU is working. By using the browser's native API for when to animate, it creates a smoother animation rather than forcing the browser to update like set timeout or set interval do. CSS animations use the animation frame rate, and so does jQuery. There will be a fallback method shown next. And like clear timeout and clear interval, you can also use cancel animation frame to stop a request for the next frame to be called. Unless you are making a game for your project, you probably won't be doing animations that call for this functionality, but it is good to be aware of. Like the timer examples, it is generally a good idea to store your request animation frame in a variable in order to have a handle on it. So you can use cancel animation frame to stop a request to the next frame from being called. Here we can see a variable called global ID that is storing a request animation frame that is calling a function called repeat often to run each time the next frame occurs. The fallback method seen here is old and may be unnecessary in your code because you are likely going to use jQuery to animate elements on your page. jQuery will have a fallback written for you that will be available whenever you use the jQuery animate or any of its set animate functions. But so you know what this code is saying, if window.request animation frame is null, i.e. it doesn't work here, or is not available to the browser, try the next thing, window.mose request animation frame, which would be run on the Firefox browser. Then it checks WebKit, then it checks Microsoft. And then if none of those things are available, use set timeout. So a quick summary. Events happen within the browser whether we listen for them or not. An event listener allows us to run code when a specific event happens on a specific object. Timers aren't events but work in a similar way. Request animation frame works with the browser's frame rate in order to animate things over time and works similarly to a set timeout timer. Let me know if you have any questions whatsoever. Thanks.